thank you all. And we're here, 4 o'clock? So straight after tea break, hopefully you're still on the coffee. I gather Sweden, I think, doesn't it consume more coffee than any other country in the world? I come from Melbourne as well as the UK, and we definitely know about coffee, but I think we could learn something from all of you. So hopefully you're still going strong. I'm going to talk today about diversity from the perspective of being the leader of and co-founder of a API specialist niche consulting business, APIsFirst in the UK. I also co-founded with a Nordic colleague of yours all, Marukka and Joha, we founded the API Collective. She apologises for not being here today. And I also lead, as more of a pro bono type of activity, the Women in APIs community, which I will be talking more about, because it sets the scene for this conversation. I'm going to ask a question. Why am I actually really poorly qualified to talk about diversity in tech? Well, yes, I'm a female, so I represent probably the largest minority of 50%, or underrepresented minority of 50%. But I'm also, English is my first language. I'm culturally, racially advantaged. I grew up in an environment where I had a lot of privilege. So I'm very conscious that I actually can only really talk on one dimension with some authority, and that has been one that I've actually ended up getting quite involved in over the years. But it has been a bit of a journey. For the first 15 years or so of my career, I started work in and around IT, usually very much on the business stakeholder consulting side of it, with a degree in engineering, and I never felt that I was really in any way disadvantaged. I would actually say I was not a feminist. I was anti-chauvinist, but I felt I wasn't really aware of anything other than probably being perhaps a little bit advantaged by being in the minority. After about 15 years or so, and I was then via London and Hong Kong, was working in Australia, and I had the privilege of getting involved with quite a lot of different women in tech types of initiatives. And these were, I was either invited to things, breakfasts, seminars, networking activities. I was being, friends would say, why don't you come along to this? I was being even sought out by female technologists who were maybe a few years behind me in their career, and they were seeking help. So I kind of started finding a little bit of a voice, if you like, about this issue. As an example, there was a very effective networking group that's still running in Melbourne that was set up to solve 3 big problems for the female pipeline in technology. One was the number of girls at high school who were not choosing IT or STEM-related studies. There was a big fall-off at that point. There was another fall-off for female students studying things like computer science, but then not opting out of careers. And there was another third problem in the career workforce for women maybe coming back after a career break or getting disillusioned or kind of hitting a glass ceiling. And this networking and pro bono program addressed each of those 3. I got quite involved with them. In fact, they had an annual gala dinner, and I remember I was working for a large financial institution at the time. We had many partners that provided us with technology, software, etc. And one of the larger partners had an account manager that I used to do a lot of day-to-day work with. He was the father of a 3-year-old daughter, I remember, and we used to talk a lot about the importance of girls getting stuck into tech and so on, and the difficulties. And I said to him one point, hey, there's a dinner coming up. Why don't you and your company, instead of maybe sponsoring a box at the sports event, very Melbourne, why don't you book a table or 2? And his instant response, without thinking, was he said, oh, I'll let Diane know about that. She's our woman in tech. And it was kind of just an example of, well-intended person who just hadn't quite thought it through about that message. So I started getting more involved. And I chose, as I was watching many activities going on where people were, some of them were sort of coffee mornings or let's all sit around and talk about kind of the problem. And I realized that the people that were really making a difference were going after something quite pointy, quite specific. And we didn't have massive resources. We had time. We were in a bank. We had fantastic networks of really enthusiastic men and women who were very happy to share their experience. And I partnered up with the career advisors and principals at some prestigious female schools in Melbourne who had a number of high school students who were very smart, but were being basically encouraged to study medicine, law, or commerce, and weren't really thinking about IT as a career. So we worked with the schools and the careers advisors and these girls and their parents and families, and we got some amazing results. By the end of the program, they came and got immersed in cyber security and human-centered design and data science for 3 days. And by the end of that immersion, 2/3 of them said they would be more likely to think of studying IT, and 3/4 of them said they'd be more likely to think of an IT career in the future. So that kind of got myself and the other people I was working on this program with really fired up about, well, you can make a difference if you go after one specific problem. It wasn't necessarily a problem that resonated with everybody. Some people were saying, well, why did you go to those private schools or even those really smart kids? Maybe you should have been working with some other place. But we actually worked with organizations that were banking customers of ours. We worked the schools themselves. We worked with people who were in our local community and we felt were very strong influencers. And it worked really well. And we had people, staff, employees going, I love your program. It's so fantastic. My daughter's school really wants to be part of this. Can we get on board? So it kind of grew organically. And then close to nearly 5 years ago, I moved back from Australia to my native UK. So if you're still trying to work out my accent, it is British with an Australian twang. And through the wonderful community of people in and around APIs, I chose to specialize from having been very much a general technologist strategist, so kind of an extension of the office of a CIO, helping large, complex incumbent industries take on and adopt the types of technology practices and tools and processes that were making them successful. And I chose to go hard in the API space. And there was a Women in APIs community at the time that had some really great, enthusiastic people who were meeting for lunches at conferences like this, but they didn't really have a very clear purpose. So I couldn't help myself. I kind of jumped in and devised this purpose, which was very small, very pointed, to help people be seen and heard in the public domain. We started at the beginning of 2020 with about 30 names on a spreadsheet, and we've now got close to 800 members. If a few of you sign up at the end of this, we might actually hit that goal. But importantly, it's a very global community. We're in 45 countries, and we run very specific niche specialist programs to help people build skills and confidence with getting up and speaking at forums and things like this. We have networking events, we have a newsletter, and it's really awesome to see a few of you here today, so thank you all. Through that process, I have probably had the privilege of about 1,000 conversations with people, men and women and everything, non-binary, about what holds them back from getting up and speaking in front of maybe not even a public audience, even sometimes just in a meeting or in front of a bunch of colleagues. And we've kind of got a top 10 now of all of the standard objections. It's like sales objections, and each one of them has but you can get over it if this happens. And it's shared by everyone. The challenge for many women is they haven't always had the opportunity to kind of get up and get along and get practice through meetups and that kind of thing. Sometimes their first experience might be something like this, which is fairly intimidating for some. So what have we been doing? We have our flagship program, we call it Get Speaking. I know we've got people like Michaela rolling it out in America this year, but this year alone we've been able to host it, we started it virtually in the pandemic, and we now, through a partnership with Google Cloud, are able to host events at their offices, which has been fantastic, and we wrap in their I Am Remarkable program, or the program that they were involved in initially, into that. We've had a couple of hundred people go through the program. We have a bunch of global mentors and coaches and facilitators from across the community. And we're running, for those who are interested in net promoter scores, so that's the old on a score out of 10, how likely would you be to recommend to someone else? We're running at plus 79. I've rounded it up to 80. But most people who are close to using those kinds of measures would suggest that that's a pretty engaged community. This is an example of the sorts of meetups we do. Everyone's sitting down in small format tables because we find that's a great way for people who maybe are new to coming to conferences. It's kind of an experience, a bit like the lunch that you had today, where people are kind of a bit happier and find it a bit, if they're not used to it, kind of an easier place to get to know and network. There's still a lot of work to do, however, and this is in the gender story overall. And I know I'm taking a while to get to APIs, by the way. Thank you for your patience. This is some data, it's a McKinsey report from a couple of years ago, highlighting really the sorts of disciplines where women are particularly underrepresented. So I'm sure this is probably familiar to many of you and the teams and the colleagues and the organizations that you work with. But I think we could suggest that as an API-related community, the disciplines that we are close to and or adjacent to ours are generally the ones that do not have a balance that reflects the wider society that we're supporting. So what are we doing in the Women in APIs community? We work on the fact that there is some research, not a lot, research that says if there are more women and people from underrepresented minorities up and speaking in front of, on the lineup at a conference or a talk or a seminar or a panel, then more women will be likely to attend. And we believe that if more women attend, then they're going to get access to all of the sorts of expertise that you've been listening to today and that you'll have, again, to experience tomorrow. They'll build better networks. They'll be able to take that back to their workplace. And that should give them success and recognition, which will show back for them on the talent of them and their teams. And that would actually give us more role models. And we're looking to try and create this virtuous circle of having more women available to speak, which is one of the challenges for all the well-intentioned conference organisers who are trying to do the right thing and get as many people as they can. But they're drawing from a small pool. We're trying to broaden that pool. We also recognise, and this is kind of a benefits thing, there's kind of a tangential connection with APIs here, where this is kind of like the enablement stuff we're doing, and this is kind of like the big long-term outcome stuff that we're doing. So Women in APIs is trying to solve this problem in order that ultimately we can have an influence on some of the data that you saw on that previous slide. What has this got to do with APIs is a good, reasonable question. Well, if you believe, as I do, and certainly many of the people that we talk to, that an organization's success and its strategic priorities and participation in the API economy relies on good understanding of data and systems and how they integrate, then they are going to need an API product portfolio that allows those strategies and responses to come to life. So they've got business technology, they need to understand business needs, technology, user requirements, they've got to understand operations. But each of these types of pillars of an organization, large enterprise or even small or medium, startup, needs some kind of a position on that will inform their API product portfolio. And that portfolio will be made up of well-designed APIs that have these kinds of characteristics. They've got to be accessible to wide audiences. Again, we've heard many talks today about the different personas that are consuming APIs and increasingly, obviously, machine versions of those, but they're internal, they're external. They've got to be well documented in plain, simple English. English becoming more and more of the kind of, the currency of communication, if you like. How easy they are to use for others, how easy are they to buy, to apply into the problems that they're trying to solve? Where are they going to deliver value? How discoverable? All of these very well known to all of you, including the, whether we call them non-functional, just functional, that have that used to be called non-functional requirements. All of these things that require the governance, the capability, and above all, are useful. And what does usefulness look like? And I'm leading on to here some of the different dimensions of what usefulness might mean. And I know we've had some comments and little threads about maybe some of the more human aspects that are coming into thinking about responsible APIs and AI kind of associated with that. This is about connecting, understanding how some of these solutions are going to fit with strategy, where value is going to come from, where creativity is sitting out, how commercial they are. I've listened to talks today about commercial governance, understanding value, and delivered with, and managed and supported with sort of confidence. And these are the characteristics of things that are going to deliver the types of organizational business problems and priorities that are brought to life with a good API portfolio. Is this all making sense? I know it's 4:15 or something, 4:20. So the other kind of next layer out on a usefulness is all of this really technical strength and depth that you would expect to have around your API portfolio. No need to go into detail because this is very much an audience that understands deeply all of these pieces. There is another ring, if you like, of different perspectives that you need to be able to build this portfolio of well-positioned APIs, useful APIs, and that's around the people that it's serving, even just the execution, the delivery, etc. Who are the operations processes that are going to support the legal aspects, the marketing, branding aspects of maybe your public APIs and how they're... So we know from the organizations we work with that more and more just the sheer stakeholder management within a large organization and increasingly beyond that into partners, customers, suppliers, the consuming side as well, is becoming more complex, more nuanced. It's certainly requiring more people. And these skills don't exist in any one person. It's like doctors, the medicine fraternity. I was talking to a general practitioner, a GP, in the UK, in the countryside, about 3 weeks ago. And he's retired, and he told me that not long ago, 25, 30 years ago, he was associated with a small rural hospital. He delivered babies. You went to visit him if you were traveling overseas and you needed an injection. He would, do minor little surgical things. He was a really multi-skilled, multi-practiced person. His job was quite interesting because of that. When I broke my wrist 4 or 5 years ago, I went to see a surgeon who only deals with operations from like the end of the fingers, I think, to below the shoulder. The physio that managed my rehab is a hand physio. That's all they do, is help people recover. So we've seen in disciplines everywhere, and technology is no different, that people have become more and more specialized, which is great, but it increases the risk of groupthink. And it also risks the need for people achieving speed over the time it takes to get other people involved. So if you think back to how many different stakeholders and people and opinions, and I'm sure many of you are in these conversations every day, it actually is much quicker and faster to just have a small number of people who kind of look and think like you and get it done. And that's great. There's a lot of need for speed and pace. But we do have to ask ourselves, with the sort of environment that we're in, whether that is necessarily coming up with always the best kind of solutions. There are a million articles out there that you can find to talk about the horror stories of things being missed. I'm drawing a long bow potentially to say that a more diverse team might have mitigated the risk of some of these. But I think people will generally feel from their own experiences, and certainly all the conversations I have, that when they have more diverse people in the room, they are more likely to, takes a bit longer to get to the solution, but it is often better. And that comes from cross-fertilization, which we can see in other industries. was excited to read last week that Sweden is an example of, on the kind of innovation per capita, it's a bit like parity purchasing power, but for innovation. Sweden's number 2 in the world. And what is clear is that more diverse teams, they take more work, but they actually deliver better on innovation. There are some challenges. One of the challenges with working on getting a more diverse team. So if you're hiring, for example, and you're struggling, I meet a lot of people who say, really struggling because we don't get enough women apply for our technical roles. And I'll say, well, how many men have you got in the organization already? Well, we don't have very many women. And I'm like, well, okay, they're probably choosing not to apply. Or the other challenge could be, and I've heard of leaders who've said, well, I really want to go out and work harder to encourage more diverse people into my team. I'm going to go and look in some different places. It's going to take me a bit longer. I'm going to need to tap some people on the shoulder and encourage them to apply. And meanwhile, they're hiring, someone else is saying, but hang on a sec, you've got to get the team built. Straight away, go and find the people. So there's a lot of healthy tension around the kinds of measures that might be being used if you're trying to achieve diversity on one side and then kind of practical commercial things on the other. And today's environment with a lot of pressure on costs, I think a lot of the sort of broader, bolder goals are being challenged. This is a standard one. This was one of the things that got me up the curve from the unconvinced to the convinced, which is, and I heard it years ago, is that if there is a job that has 10 things that are needed for the person to apply, so the job description has 10 things, a woman will typically only apply if she can already do all 10. And a male will typically look at it and go, I can do number 1, 4, 5, I'm perfect, I'll give it a bash. I didn't realize that was real because I was actually I was more like that. But there are many people who have had that experience, and it's something to be very aware of. You may already be that. More mind, slower decisions. This is actually, yes, it may take longer, but the upshot is you will come up with better decisions. So that innovation type of index we were talking about is very real and is very positive, and it comes from great API types of designs. I also feel there's a lot of learning through conversation. So we believe that change happens one conversation at a time, and it's often the smaller conversations that people have with their partners and their mothers and sisters and daughters and people that start kind of giving them a different perspective on some of the things that happen every day. We ran a panel a couple of years ago with a CEO of a startup in London who had got about, well, it wasn't a startup, it was scale-up really, 300 or 400 people, I think. They acquired another company that had worked really hard from the outset in a very balanced team, gender-wise. And so he was proud now, 18 months down the track, of being able to talk about how diverse his team was. And this was his direct quote when I asked him what was different after 18 months. They're more successful, they make better decisions, and it's just a nicer place to work, which I'm sure all of you in that kind of environment would recognize. But we still see a lot of people who are not there. We had another lady on the panel who was she represented what I saw as very much kind of API digital talent, and she talked about a very big prestigious company who she had applied for a role for, or they headhunted her. They then gave her the list of 7 people that she had to go through the interview process with, and she looked them all up, and every one of them was a male, and she just pulled her application. So she never even got into the pipeline or to the point. So we used it as an example of how organizations might be missing out on the opportunity of finding and attracting some of this diverse talent, still with the best intentions. I'm going to leave you with this, I'm going to share this stat with you, which a lot of people have not heard of. In the US, where admittedly they take a lot less holidays than Europeans, for example, but the stats are that the average female in the workforce spends 200 hours a year on what they call these NPTs, these non-promotable tasks. They're organizing the morning coffee for the International Women's Day. They're booking that gala dinner. They're running things that are seen as not real work. But doing DEI stuff properly, DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, is very much the American acronym. It's diversity and inclusion in Australia, D&I. It seems to be EDI in the UK, which I thought was electronic data interchange, but anyway, some acronyms keep going. What we've been doing in Women in APIs, we talk about moving on from microaggressions. We've been running a campaign for micro-amplifications. So microaggressions in people that talk about gender will say things like, a woman might put up a suggestion in a meeting if she's the only person. It gets ignored. Someone else in the room will say the same thing half an hour later, and everybody will go, that's a great idea. Now, I often ask groups of women how many times have they ever had an experience like that? And everyone will put their hand up. And then I'll usually follow it up with, and how many times has it happened in the last 2 weeks? And sadly, often, half the women will keep their hand up. So it is real. It may not be as real here in a country like Sweden that has, really set the bar for so much of the rest of the world, among the Nordics in kind of what equity is about and equality. But it's these kinds of things that are small things that people can do every day. And that's what we hear in the community globally, are the kinds of things where people can make a difference. So I'd invite people always, another thing I say to people is, go and follow up and have conversations that are not maybe the ones you normally would have. Read different newspapers. We know that the algorithms, unfortunately, are forcing us into our own echo chambers, and I'm very conscious that even in the women kind of tech agenda, that is an echo chamber of its own. So I try and get challenged myself. And I'll be quite honest, where I am at the moment in my journey, I'm worried that I'm actually kind of getting a bit less convinced on this stuff. I'm being very open, by the way. I haven't shared this with anybody, apart from you're the first people to hear it. And it's because I'm seeing a lot of this stuff. I won't even leave it up there for too long, because it's kind of a little bit worrying, but maybe it's important. There are a lot of people out around talking about some of these initiatives and programs that have unfortunately been overly tokenistic. Maybe the pendulum has been pushed too far and it's creating an equal and opposite reaction. I think this is a kind of conversation, I'll be quite honest, that it would be interesting to have. Maybe it's not here, maybe it's certainly not with this group. I don't think you would have chosen to come and listen to this talk today if you were anywhere in that kind of thing. But I think there are people around us who are perhaps, understandably maybe, I'm trying to understand it in detail, think about where we've gone. So when people ask, kind of hoping that I'm going up this way, by the way, on the curve, people often ask me, particularly male allies, what can I do to help? And there's lots of things. I talk about those micro-amplifications, and I also talk about getting involved. Get informed. If you're talking to people who are really kind of getting started on this stuff, then invite them to go and spend some time to kind of rationalize it for themselves. Work out the business case, or work out the commercial case, or work out the diversity proposition, and everybody's rationale will be different. And then start getting involved. Here are some things that we're doing in the Women in APIs community. Please join. Everybody's welcome. We would love to have you in the community. Here are some places where we are running that Get Speaking program that we've done recently this year. So you can see plenty of activities going on around the world. And my last thing, and this is something I'm always reminding myself, is not to get too comfortable. I often think of where we are on the diversity story as on a scale. So on gender in tech, I would probably rate myself about 7 or 8 out of 10. And if I'm having a conversation with some of my other peers from the Women in APIs community, for example, who are probably somewhere there as well, we will have quite a different conversation than, or if we're then, somebody who's kind of like, but aren't they a diversity hire, and wouldn't we be lowering the standards if we kind of allowed? And you realize it's not the place to react. It's like, okay, they're where I was 15 years ago. Now, I know that on that scale, I can't talk about race in the same way, because it's not a lived experience. There are many other kind of dimensions of ability and language and those types of things, where I'm, could be anywhere from 2 to whatever. But I would invite you to always think, if you want to help the community at large, kind of work out in your mind where people are at, and then that can help you move forward. So that's me. Thank you very much for listening. Would love to connect with anybody, join the community, hear more about what we're doing, have an uncomfortable conversation. We're up for it. Thank you.